It's been 10 years since the premiere of Power Rangers Megaforce. Now, Power Rangers is a franchise of ups and downs. It is such a fun and charming show, unless it's not. Some seasons are actually boring and terrible, and Megaforce is one of those seasons. It's incredibly generic, with uninteresting characters and storylines. 2 years ago, on the anniversary of the premiere of Power Rangers Samurai, a show that's not as bad as Megaforce, but also isn't a creative highlight of the series, I talked about the behind-the-scenes things that went on with Samurai, which made it bad in the end. So now, since it's the 30th anniversary of the franchise, it's time to take a look back at Megaforce and see why it ended up so terrible. The story is one similar to Samurai, but with lower lows and less of an excuse for the series being bad. It's a story of battles over creativity, and it's the story of why it's considered by some fans to be the worst season of Power Rangers to ever be made. So to quickly recap why Samurai was bad, when Saban bought back the rights to Power Rangers from Disney in May of 2010, they already had a deal struck with Nickelodeon to produce two 22-episode seasons to begin broadcast in the winter of 2011. This gave them about 9 months to be ready for the show to start airing, and that included assembling a writer's room, going through pre-production including shipping props and costumes from Japan and building new ones, as well as sets, casting, and being ready to start filming in like 3 months. The show was basically forced, especially early on in its run, to essentially being a watered-down Google Translate version of its source material, Samurai Sentai Shinkenger. But it's what was necessary for the show to be made in time, even if it wasn't the most ideal of circumstances. Megaforce, on the other hand, had more time to figure out what it was going to be. The title Power Rangers Megaforce was first trademarked by Saban in late 2011, so we can assume that that's around the time that Nickelodeon renewed the series past Super Samurai, and Saban started to get somewhat of an idea of where the series would go. And it was at this point that there was a really exciting opportunity as to what Megaforce could have been. Because no new season of Power Rangers was produced in 2010, and Shinkenger was adapted over 2 years instead of 1, there were 3 seasons of Super Sentai to choose from. During the original Saban and Disney eras, the only option for the next season of Power Rangers was the season of Sentai that was airing the year Power Rangers was. However, there was now the 2010 Sentai, Tensu Sentai Gozeiger, the 2011 Sentai, Kaizoku Sentai Gokaiger, and the 2012 Sentai, Tokumi Sentai Go Busters. Megaforce was a pretty generic subtitle, so the 2 speculatory camps the Power Rangers fandom fell into were that they would adapt Gozeiger because it was the next season in line, or that they would adapt Gokaiger. Gokaiger was the 35th season of Super Sentai, and for the first time had a season-long gimmick to celebrate that. The Gokaigers had the ability to use Ranger keys to transform into any past team of Super Sentai, and the PR fans thought that since Megaforce would air in 2013, Saban would skip over Gozeiger and adapt Gokaiger and use that anniversary gimmick for the 20th anniversary of Power Rangers. And that would have made sense. However, when Megaforce was officially announced in June of 2012, it was revealed to be an adaptation of Gozeiger. This upset some fans who were perplexed as to why Saban would do this. And according to inside sources at Saban at the time, they were actually not allowed to skip Sentai seasons at all, meaning they were forced to adapt Gozeiger. However, as far as I can tell, this was a rule that was put in place by Saban at the time, not Toei, the people who make Super Sentai, which makes a lot of sense because Toei really doesn't give a shit about Power Rangers as long as the check clears. So it would make sense that this was actually an internal rule at Saban, which, by the way, was completely abandoned after Megaforce. It seemed that Megaforce was going to be the 20th anniversary season via a different route, by being somewhat of an homage to the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Gozeiger did have some similarities to MMPR, notably in having the same color lineup and the traditional 5 combining weapons and Zords. However, it seemed they would be twisting the plot of Gozeiger to hew closer to the original Power Rangers series, with the show featuring 5 teenagers being given powers by a wizard and a robot to fight an alien invasion. And this is a good thing. Remember, Samurai was bad because it couldn't be anything other than a cheap copy and paste of the source material. But because of the anniversary and the fact that Gozeiger's angel-based plot probably wouldn't have worked very well in the US anyway, from the get-go Megaforce wasn't going to be like Samurai. It would take cues from Gozeiger, but it would be its own original story. and with the production team having much more time to plan out the season, this was possible. There were even clear signs of a greater endgame in store for the franchise. In August of 2012, the first trailer was released for Megaforce, though since production wouldn't start for another few weeks, it was just clips from Gozager. However, the trailer also included a clip from Gokaiger, specifically the iconic Legend War segment, which saw all of the different Super Sentai team up in a battle against the Zangiyak Empire, the villains from Gokaiger. So would the show be building up to a Legend War event at the end of Megaforce, which would lead into a Gokaiger adaptation in 2015? Well, not exactly. Later in 2012, as cameras would continue to roll on Megaforce, casting sites leaked for the series, one casting for a Silver Ranger. Now, Gozager doesn't have a Silver Ranger, but Gokaiger does. So rumors were at the time that they would be featuring original footage of the 6th Ranger from Gokaiger into Megaforce Season 2, aka Super Megaforce, which would air in 2014. Then, as the first Megaforce set photos surfaced at the end of the year, a cave set with the walls lined with the Ranger keys from Gokaiger was revealed, which would turn out to be the Megaforce Rangers' base of operations when the series premiered in February 2013. Later that same month, production began on Super Megaforce, and leaked set photos revealed a very different approach to the next season. These photos revealed they were filming on set with the Gokaiger suits. This revealed to the fans that rather than Gozager and Gokaiger each being adapted into two 22-episode seasons like Shinkenger was for Samurai and Super Samurai, they would each be adapted into one season. Megaforce would be an adaptation of Gozager, and Super Megaforce would be an adaptation of Gokaiger. Now, I'm not necessarily going to criticize this approach because it makes sense in a lot of ways. They wanted to make the most out of the anniversary and they weren't allowed to skip seasons, so they decided to do one season that was an homage to MMPR before going into the real anniversary stuff. And I really don't want to criticize this because it could have turned out well, but it really didn't. I'm pretty much just going to be talking about Season 1, Megaforce, today, but let me make it clear that Super Megaforce isn't that much better, and I'm sure I'll make a video about it at some point. I don't like to do much reviewing on this channel anymore. I prefer to just speak the facts and let you decide how you feel about it. But Megaforce, even from an objective standpoint, is just not a very good show. The first few episodes actually show some promise. The pilot, Mega Mission, is a pretty decent homage to Day of the Dumpster and Mighty Morphin as a whole, and the next 2 or 3 episodes feature some pretty good story and character work. But then it goes really downhill. The show quickly devolves into a generic kids action show that feels almost like a parody of Power Rangers, taking cliches into extremes. By the end of the season, the characters are virtually unchanged, and the audience knows next to nothing about them. I remember when the show first premiered, there were these descriptions on the Nickelodeon website for each of the Rangers, describing who they were and what they liked. But by the end of the season, so much of that is left untouched. Troy was supposed to be into karate, but we see him practicing karate on a roof in the first episode. He creates a Rube Goldberg machine for training in episode 4, and then we see him practicing karate in a gi later in the series once or twice, basically as B-roll. There were no stories about his karate, just occasional scenes showing that he doesn't. It was the same thing with Jake playing soccer and Emma doing BMX and taking pictures. Noah and Gia didn't even get activities to do, they were just given generic character silhouettes like smart nerdy guy and cool tough girl that also has a heart. So Power Rangers sometimes does this thing where it'll have character focus episodes focusing on just one of the Rangers where they have to learn some moral lesson, and even though each Ranger gets a few of these throughout the season or 2 that they're on, they don't actually end up being that much different by the end of the show. But this show doesn't even have focus episodes. The focus is always on the Rangers fighting bad guys and almost never on their actual lives. And they don't even really do that right. I haven't seen all of Gozager, but from what I know and from what is obvious in the show itself, the Warstar aliens are actually defeated not long into its run. So the show basically has a cavalcade of villains that it goes through over the course of the season. But I guess in order to make it feel like the series had one big threat, they essentially keep the Warstar around as background villains even after they run out of footage of them, waiting until the end of the season to adapt the last Warstar episode. The problem is that Robo Knight, the 6th Ranger, wasn't introduced in Gozager until after the War Star are defeated. So that episode has Robo Knight just kinda chilling in a library, oblivious to one of the biggest alien attacks the city has ever seen. And the Rangers, conveniently enough, just don't end up using all of the weapons that we've spent so much time painstakingly and lazily introducing over the course of the series. And even then, this isn't the season finale. This is the 3rd to last episode, so they spend all this time building up this main villain and have him get defeated, only for them to have a different main villain for the last 2 episodes. And because of this, the last 2 episodes of Megaforce feel very lackluster. I mean, the penultimate episode starts with the Rangers thinking that they've won and it's time to just go home. Oh, and by the way, the last 2 episodes of Megaforce, smushes together footage from 5 episodes of Gozager and still doesn't even get to the last 6 episode arc of the season. Which brings me to the next thing. Because they only had 20 episodes to show pretty much all of Gozager, there are episodes where they basically just cram in as much Sentai footage as possible into each episode. When Power Rangers started, they'd have a 22-minute episode with 15 minutes of original footage and 7 minutes of Sentai footage. But in Megaforce, it's usually the opposite. They just had so much to cram in that they had no time for character work, just burning through monsters and Zord fights and introducing new Zords. They end up having to introduce a new Zord or weapon or power-up in almost every episode, just because I guess they needed to, otherwise it wouldn't make sense why they would just be using stuff they never used before. At that rate, why not just have most of the arsenal available from the beginning, but they just don't always need to use all of it, and they still need to go through additional training to learn how to use some of it. The last few episodes really are atrocious in how much Japanese footage they use, but perhaps the worst episode is Ultra Power, which comes in about the halfway point of the season. After the very first shot that we see after the theme song, there is no original footage until the 21-minute mark. Almost 20 minutes of this episode was just dubbed over Japanese footage. I remember seeing panels from Power Morphicon of the Megaforce cast complaining about how brutal the ADR sessions were, and they had to have been, because most of the episodes was just them screaming at the top of their lungs into a microphone. And not only was this a measure to keep the story going, but it was also a cost-cutting measure. I don't know if Power Rangers has ever looked cheaper than Megaforce, and it's not just from shooting as little original footage as possible. The show just looks bad. There are only a handful of sets used in every episode, and when they aren't the school or something, they look so cheap. Look at the command center. It's just fake-looking rock with some lights, ranger keys, and some podiums. It feels so basic and small. I mean, even just compare that to the original command center set from the 90s. It's not my favorite Ranger-based set, but at least on the limited budget, it still looked relatively spacious and high-tech for the time. For a place that's been around for millennia, the Megaforce Command Center hasn't had very many renovations, and the direction just isn't good. Everything looks the same. The first episode 2 had some interesting shots, or even just scenes shot at night, which tends to look revolutionary in Power Rangers. Every possible place that they could have cut corners, they did. And this was presumably because they wanted to save up money for the Legend War in Super Megaforce. And maybe that would have worked if they also didn't waste money on shit they didn't need. Because there are some head-scratching moments in the show where they spend money that they really didn't need to spend. There's an episode a little over halfway through the season called Last Laugh, and it's okay. But for some reason, the production team decided they were just gonna throw bags of money at this okay episode that doesn't push the plot forward at all. They spent money on 5 guest actors that all had a couple of lines each. They built a whole set for the episode that was just for this episode, which I don't think they did for any other episode of the series. And on top of all that, they did a painstaking recreation of a Sentai location so that it would better match the footage. Why they decided to do all this and also have an episode where 20 minutes was just Japanese footage, I could not tell you. So why did Megaforce turn out so shitty? Well, if we're gonna try and pin it on one guy, which we probably shouldn't because there were 1,000 people working on the show, and many of them had input over how the show turned out, the person to blame is Jonathan Tzachor. Jonathan Tzachor was a producer on Power Rangers throughout the entirety of the original Saban era. and after Chip Lin, who had been the showrunner since Power Rangers Turbo, left after Power Rangers Time Force, he became sort of the de facto showrunner for Saban's final season, which was also sort of Disney's first when they acquired Saban's parent company Fox Family Worldwide. Power Rangers Wild Force was notable for being quite similar to its source material, Hyakuju Sentai Gao Ranger. And supposedly, this was Jonathan Tzakor's inclination, with the other writers trying to make the series more original and Zackor wanting to stick to Gao Ranger. When Saban bought Power Rangers back, they brought Zackor back to oversee the series again as showrunner, and James W. Bates was hired to be story editor, essentially his second in command. And Jonathan Tzakor's love for the source material was seen as an asset to Saban during production of Samurai and Super Samurai, but obviously this wasn't as useful during Megaforce. Instead of championing that Gozager was some sacred text that should be stuck to, Zackor's Sentai fetish seemed to manifest in a different way by demanding that as much Sentai footage be crammed into each episode as possible. Having story arcs for the Rangers or even showing their lives outside of that was not very high on his list of priorities. The thing about Zackor is he's a director and he's very visual, and that often leads to some really great direction, even plot structure in the first episode or two of shows that he does. Lionheart, the first episode of Wild Force, is one of the most creative and unique openers in Power Rangers history, and the first few episodes of Samurai have some great direction and cinematography. And Mega Mission is legitimately a good episode that takes a lot of what was great about MMPR and modernizes it. However, his shows always fall off, and fast. Just about everything they bring back from MMPR in Mega Mission just kinda doesn't appear again. The Rangers are teleported to the command center and then never teleport anywhere in the series even once after this. This episode features the first and only time in the series the Rangers do an unmorphed fight against the Foot Soldiers. I understand they're kind of impractical to do, but they literally never do it again. So the show doesn't even really succeed in being an homage to the original Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Now, if I ever do a video on Super Megaforce, I'll talk more in depth about this then, but apparently there were many planned plot lines for the characters the other writers came up with that never happened because of these rules Zackor mandated. This show is so bad. The potential that the first few episodes had is just completely wasted as the show devolves into this generic action show that thinks it's interesting because it has explosions. Even Super Megaforce is better because it has a little bit of a more interesting story and it has the anniversary stuff to hold you over. Megaforce really does feel like a boring parody of Power Rangers, being one of the cheapest and laziest looking products to come out of the franchise. Like, yeah, Power Rangers was founded on being cheap. It's an action show where the action is just cut and paste from another show. It was designed as a show where you only need to shoot like 15 minutes of footage per episode, and it's the cheapest 15 minutes of the episode to produce. But this show takes it to a whole new level, and it's just embarrassing, especially when this is supposed to be the 20th anniversary celebration of the franchise. I have to admit, having grown up with it, I do have some level of nostalgia for it. But even at the time, I wasn't crazy about it, and rewatching it for this video was actually painful. What do you guys think of this show? Do you agree, disagree? Maybe some of you out there really like Megaforce. If you, like me, aren't really a fan, feel free to discuss that in the comments, but please keep it civil, especially when you're talking about the cast and crew, which are people that exist, so please be respectful. And feel free to check out some of my other videos while you're here. If you like this one, you'll probably like them too. See ya.